Sparrows is a 2025 romantasy novel by Devney. Apparently this one's already got a movie in production, so that's interesting. This was another audiobook I kind of took a chance on. I knew vaguely about Shield of Sparrows and how it was one of those new favorite romantasy darlings that everybody was hyped up for. Might have seen it advertised on Instagram or Goodreads at some point, but it was really just, Libby has it, so let's throw a request out and have a listen once it's available kind of thing. We follow Odessa Cross, the elder princess of Quentis. She's got a king for a dad, a dead mom, an uptight stepmom, a fiance, a baby brother, and a slightly younger sister who's due to be engaged to a dude named Xavier Wolf, the king of a rival kingdom. Oh god, these these romantasy names get me every single time. Anyway, little sister, May, is supposed to marry Mr. Wolf. There's this magical agreement between the kingdoms where basically a girl called the Sparrow gets to go marry the prince of another kingdom. It relates back to something that happened ages ago. I think it was a war. I don't know, and honestly, does it even matter? The point is arranged marriage trope. Except that when Prince Xavier shows up to the castle to meet May, he demands to marry Odessa instead. Immediately, as payment for killing some monsters. He invokes some old loophole or law that basically allows him to demand which princess he marries, and he wants Odessa. And because of the magical agreement between the kingdoms, the king can't really deny the request or he'll die. So not really a choice. As such, the king is forced to give his daughter the speed run of May's instructions before her wedding. She was supposed to go to Tura not just as a princess, but as a spy, and she was also tasked with spying on and potentially killing the Guardian, the prince's right-hand man who possesses strange magical powers, including heightened strength. Odessa's not really cut out to be spy master, but again, not really a whole lot of choices available here. Odessa marries Xavier the next day, and the day after that is loaded up onto a ship with her husband, two ladies' maids, the dreaded Guardian, and they head for Tura. It becomes painfully obvious very quickly that the Guardian is hot, and that Odessa would really like to bing-bong him, except that, like every other love interest in books like this, he's kind of a smarmy, smirking dickhead, and he infuriates Odessa whilst also getting her panties most assuredly damp. I kind of hate myself for saying that, I'm sorry. Anyway, half the backbone of the plot ultimately comes out to the fact that the world's monsters are starting to become infected with something called Lysa, which I kept hearing as Lysol when listening to the audiobook, which was extremely funny and added to my listening experience. In any case, the monsters of the world are infected by Lysa, making them more aggressive towards humans, and incidentally, we find out that the Guardian is also infected with Lysa, which is why he's super strong and super fast. The other half of the plot's backbone is made up by the mysteries Odessa is faced with. Why did Xavier choose her over her sister? Why does her father want her to spy on the Turans and kill the Guardian? Why is everyone playing so coy about the capital city and its location? Where did the Lysa come from, and how does one get rid of it? Why was Odessa's stepmother so weirdly insistent on dyeing her naturally red hair brown for most of her life? Most of these things end up answered. The last one gets to be a fun little dun-dun-dun moment at the end of the book, but, we have to hook into the sequel. There is one other thing hanging over the characters' heads throughout the course of the novel, and that's the Crux migration. The Crux are basically these big monster bird bitches that migrate once every 30, 40 years, I forget. But it's a big deal because these creatures are, in addition to being extremely deadly, they're also insanely hard to kill. The migration is basically a source of mass trauma for everyone in this fantasy world because they always suffer ridiculously high and gruesome losses whenever a Crux migration happens. Everyone dreads it, everyone wants to put a stop to it, and it's part of why getting rid of Lysa is such a big deal. The Crux are dangerous enough without the magical equivalent of 5 Red Bulls. That is, in effect, the plot. Wow, Jenny, pretty sparse. Listen, there are some books that are easier to recap than others. Shield of Sparrows is definitely an other. I've been trying to figure out why this one was so hard to recap, and I guess I'll put it like this. Shield of Sparrows is very character-driven, but it also entwines the plot nicely in with those characters and their development. There is some solid effort put into the world building, which I felt was, again, worked in very nicely with the characters and the plot without coming across as head wacky. And the author was clever enough to do some rigging. Odessa has never been to Tura, and the kingdom overall is very secretive, so we get to learn a lot of this stuff with her in a way that feels reasonable and natural. This also allows there to be a solid sense of mystery in the novel. Where did the Lysa come from? Why did Xavier choose to marry Odessa instead of May? Why won't he take Odessa to the capital? Most of the questions, like I said before, end up answered in their own time, and a few are left deliberately unanswered now in anticipation for the next book. In terms of storytelling and world building, I actually felt that Shield of Sparrows was a decent fantasy book with Romantasy at the center. It avoided falling into a lot of the stereotypes and tropes that Romantasy books tend to play into, and it took its time to develop a decent fantasy world with characters that I actually remember and care about. They felt relevant to the plot and well developed for the most part, and when they were injured or killed, it actually felt meaningful. This book, in my opinion, succeeds where a lot of Romantasy fails. It was a good Romantasy. But it is still a Romantasy, and so naturally it does fall into some of the stereotypes. First, the modern language. This is controversial amongst Romantasy fans. Lots of people are fine with it and don't see it as a big deal. Lots of people argue that it's dumb and not suitable for a fantasy setting, particularly a high fantasy setting. High fantasy is when we're like in a completely different, world. Like Lord of the Rings is high fantasy. There's not really much or any connection to our world. So modern language can kind of feel very jarring because it's a completely different world and yet they talk just like us. Now, I have a foot in both camps here. I don't think it's that big of a deal, and that the author should do whatever they want or feel is best for their book in terms of the language. If it crashes and burns, then that's on them. However, I personally do not like super modern language in fantasy settings. Like, for example, if a character says fuck, I don't have a problem with that. The word and other variants of it have been around for a very long time. Real world curse words are not necessarily out of place in a fantasy novel. Hell, Between Two Fires was a historical horror fantasy novel, and there was a wide variety of bad words in it, including several we still use today. So that's fine. But when you start saying stuff like this on page 1, quote, "And if I was late, I'd be in deep shit. Margot would kick my ass if I missed this meeting with the Turin warriors father had invited to Quentis, so there'd be no jumping," unquote. It isn't just the language, it's the phrasing and also who's saying it. I'd be in deep shit. Margot would kick my ass. First, Odessa is royalty, so the presumption is that she will have been raised in and educated as to royal manners and etiquette. Again, authors can do whatever they want with their writing, but for me and some other readers, it kind of breaks immersion and strains suspension of disbelief when a princess raised in a royal household with royal manners talks like a sailor. And additionally, the way she says it just screams modern. Margot would kick my ass. Just off the top of my head, if we're going for a medieval setting, you could say, Margot would tan my hide, or Margot would whip me bloody, or Margot would allow me no peace. All three of those phrasings feel plausibly older. You could believe that someone in the Middle Ages might say that. I don't know if they actually would. They might have had other variants. But it still conveys the same meaning while sounding basically accurate for that time period. This is also absolutely no shade to Devney Perry specifically. For all I know, she made a conscious choice to write this way because she wanted to characterize Odessa that way. But when I see this kind of modern language, modern vulgarity in books explicitly set in an older, kind of high fantasy setting, it can almost come across as like a little lazy, because I guess I would say like you chose to make a high or higher fantasy novel, but the characters talk just the way we do in the real world. I feel like some authors use it as a shortcut because they want the high fantasy setting, but they don't want to put the work into developing the dialogue in such a way that sounds realistic for the setting and tone of the work. Again, no shade to Devney Perry specifically, because for all I know, this was a very deliberate writing choice she made, and it's her right to make it. I'm just noticing a trend across a lot of Romantasy books. Speaking of trends, I mentioned it in the review, but it becomes painfully obvious pretty early on that the Guardian is the designated love interest of this book and series. I swear there is a cookie-cutter template that Romantasy authors are dead-ass stuck on, because he reads just like so many other Romantasy love interests. Smirking, teasing, giving the female character a nickname, dominant verging on domineering, sometimes crossing over into it, tragically traumatized, although I'll grant you that the Guardian doesn't lean quite as heavily into the trope as some other novels do, and, of course, he's a muscle-bound hunk. Now, I'm not saying that all of these traits are bad. I'm just saying that I'm seeing a pattern in a lot of romantasy books where this is the type of guy that the main female character is into, and it comes across as very cookie cutter. It's all in the execution, and in Shield of Sparrow's case, the execution is very, very similar to Fourth Wing, Lightlark, Akatar, and a few others that I've read. The constellation of traits in romantasy men are often not ones that I personally find attractive. However, in reading romantasy and taking the genre for what it is, I recognize that there are loads of readers who do, and I adjust my judgment accordingly. With that being said, there was one specific moment that kind of pushed me over the edge where the Guardian is concerned. This is, according to my e-reader anyway, page 293 of the ebook in relation to Odessa sneaking out and visiting another town. Quote, and this is the Guardian speaking initially. "Why didn't you ask?" "What?" I stammered. The Guardian's voice was calm, collected. The silver in his eyes began to melt away, the hazel taking its place. "Haven't you been granted your every request? If you wanted to explore Ashmore, why didn't you ask?" I stared at him, jaw slack and mind whirling. "Did you ever stop to think that maybe the door to your cage has always been unlocked, Sparrow? And all you had to do was push it open? Was that really true? Could I simply have asked?" Unquote. This passage got me so fucking tilted in a book that was otherwise pretty decent, especially as far as romantasy goes, as far as I'm concerned. And it got me tilted because literally on the previous page, 292, if my e-reader is right, Odessa straight up tells the Guardian, quote, "I didn't ask to be married to a stranger and shipped across the continent. I didn't ask to come to Tura. I didn't ask to be jailed in a wilderness treehouse. Those were decisions made for me by the whims of men." Unquote. My bitch-ass brother in Christ, Odessa has just looked you in the eye and explained to you why it never occurred to her to ask. You and Xavier did not ask if she wanted to get married. You demanded it in such a way that, if I recall correctly, her dad could not refuse without literally dying. You have made it clear that you don't trust her. You've been ducking and dodging her questions, and you have deliberately trapped her in a treehouse. And while your motivations for doing so were not entirely unreasonable, given that Odessa is supposed to be spying on you, I'm really stumped on where you think she might have gotten the idea that simply asking to breach containment and take a day trip was feasible. I think the fact that the book is so tolerable otherwise is what made this line so infuriating to me. It almost feels a little insulting to my intelligence because it's like, what reasonable person is going to look at this situation and go, "OMG, Odessa, you're such a dumbass. Just ask if you can leave town for the day." Every single piece of evidence presented to us thus far suggests that Xavier and the Guardian will refuse, and yet this line and scene read like we're meant to take it at face value as an indicator of Odessa's personal issues and not a reflection of the Guardian's behavior up until this point. I can handle the stereotypical romantasy love interest, but I draw the line at revisionist history. The Guardian and Xavier's actions clearly indicate that while they're not planning on torturing Odessa or denying her things that she needs or even wants within reason, they are keeping secrets from her and are trying to keep her where they want her. Just because they never explicitly said, "You are not allowed to leave this town," does not mean it wasn't implied in their behavior and actions. Odessa's choice to sneak out was, in my opinion, entirely logical based on their behavior. There was one other thing about the Guardian that really pissed me off, and it's like, damn, I'm trying to keep the big spoilers out of this one, so I'll put it vaguely. There is a very, very big reveal about the Guardian about 70% of the way through the book, I think. There's a really good chance that you'll figure it out before you get there if you read it and you're paying attention. But it's a very, very big deal and changes the nature of his and Odessa's relationship to one another. When Odessa finds out, she is just furious. And honestly, she has every right to be given the circumstances. But the Guardian just seems to find it funny. He thinks it's hilarious and I wasn't a fan already, but him treating this so lightly made me so mad. Odessa's reaction was treated as a joke, even though this reveal has major implications for her life and future. I don't know if it was the author's intention in doing so, but he came across as a huge dickhead for his reaction to Odessa here. One other small criticism I had for this book is that it felt a little aimless. I know the theoretical goal of the novel was for Odessa to get to the capital and spy for her dad, but the story at times kind of seems to lose sight of that in favor of other storylines and mysteries that Odessa was faced with. There were a lot of points where I was kind of like, okay, cool, we're chilling here. What's the goal? What are we doing? Where are we going? I'll compare it to another fantasy book, The Jasmine Throne. The story follows multiple characters as they go about their lives and all their storylines, and the events within them serve to push the plot forward. We don't know what the novel is building to, but we know based on the characters' actions that it's building towards something in the end, some big conflict that progressively gets easier to see as the story goes on. Shield of Sparrows, I think, sometimes lost sight of what it was building up to. It wasn't too bad, but sometimes it felt like the book veered off the path and took its sweet time bringing us back to it. It's 528 pages long, so it certainly has the room to do so. But not every stroll off the beaten path results in the plot being pushed forward, so it can come across as tedious sometimes. Though, again, I have to advertise my bias. Not liking the Guardian and not really giving a shit about his relationship with Odessa, sometimes the relationship building scenes that didn't necessarily advance the plot might have come across as tedious to me, whereas for a Romantasy fan, they may have been very interesting and satisfying. So yeah, that's really all I have to say about Shield of Sparrows. It's probably one of the better Romantasy novels I've come across thus far, but it still falls into some of the tropes of the genre that I find annoying. I might check out the sequel, I might not, but if you're someone who's maybe looking for a Romantasy that leans more towards the fantasy side of the scale than it does the romance, and avoids some of the tropes and conventions of the genre, this might not be a bad one to check out.